Let's begin by examining the role of Donald Trump in fueling Benjamin Netanyahu, whose political trajectory and ultimately his failure. Trump didn't just support Netanyahu, he empowered him to abandon restraint altogether. Historically, American presidents have tried, at least rhetorically, to position themselves as brokers of peace, nudging Israel toward a negotiated settlement with the Palestinians. But Trump broke from that tradition entirely. He offered Netanyahu uncritical support, not in pursuit of stability, but in pursuit of ideological alignment and political convenience. That alignment proved catastrophic. Consider the decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It was hailed by Netanyahu as a historic victory, but in truth, it shattered what little credibility the United States had left as a neutral arbiter. It erased decades of diplomatic ambiguity that had been essential to keeping dialogue, however fragile, on the table. More importantly, it signaled to Netanyahu that there were no longer any meaningful constraints on his ambitions. The Trump administration wasn't merely a passive observer. It was an active participant in redrawing the rules of engagement, rewarding unilateralism over compromise. That dynamic intensified with the Abraham Accords. These agreements were framed as breakthroughs for peace, but in reality, they sidestepped the Palestinian issue entirely. Trump and Netanyahu, who rebranded the normalization of relations with Arab autocracies as proof that the conflict could be ignored, or worse, erased. But Mearsheimer's realism reminds us that you cannot eliminate a central actor from a conflict without consequences. By bypassing the Palestinians, Netanyahu and Trump didn't solve the problem, they deepened it, masking it behind photo ops and diplomatic spectacle. This kind of political maneuvering reveals something deeper about the psychological alignment between Trump and Netanyahu. Both leaders thrive on perception over substance, on dominance over dialogue. They see politics as a zero-sum game, where the appearance of strength is more important than strategic foresight. Trump's validation allowed Netanyahu to embrace a posture of maximalism, not because it was wise, but because it played well with the domestic base and satisfied a short-term hunger for control. But as history often shows, when leaders are rewarded for abandoning balance, they begin to believe their own myths. Netanyahu, buoyed by Trump's support, convinced himself that the old rules no longer applied, that Israel could entrench its occupation, marginalize the Palestinians, and still enjoy global legitimacy. That illusion was shattered not by enemies, but by reality itself. A strategy built on denial eventually collapses under the weight of truth. In the end, Trump didn't just enable Netanyahu's tactics, he accelerated his strategic misjudgment. And in doing so, he helped transform a calculated politician into an ideologue blind to consequence. The tragedy is not just that Netanyahu fell into this trap, but that it was laid for him by an ally who understood power but not responsibility. The lesson here is stark. When support becomes blind, it ceases to be support, it becomes sabotage masquerading as friendship. Another crucial dynamic to consider is how Donald Trump dismantled the already fragile system of restraint that once governed U.S. Israeli relations. For decades, American administrations, both Republican and Democrat, maintained a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, they provided Israel with military aid and diplomatic backing. On the other, they applied just enough pressure to prevent Israel from spiraling into outright annexationist extremism. It wasn't a perfect system, far from it, but there was at least an implicit understanding that Washington's support came with limits. Trump obliterated that framework. By removing all conditionality from America's support, Trump effectively untethered Netanyahu from the political and strategic constraints that had once shaped Israeli policy. The result was not stability, but a form of political indulgence that encouraged Netanyahu to pursue ideologically driven goals with little regard for long-term consequences. What emerged was a dangerous illusion, the belief that Israel could dominate indefinitely without incurring any real cost. This is where Mearsheimer's realist perspective becomes essential. In international politics, unchecked power often leads to miscalculation. When leaders begin to believe they can act without constraint, when they internalize the myth that they are immune from blowback, they lose the capacity for strategic self-awareness. And that's exactly what happened to Netanyahu. He mistook American silence for consent, and consent for permanence. With Trump in the White House, the mechanisms of accountability eroded. There were no red lines, no consequences, only applause. This shift also had profound psychological effects. Netanyahu, a man long known for his tactical shrewdness, began to govern as if restraint itself were a weakness. He embraced policies from expanding settlements deep into the West Bank to proposing de jure annexation that no previous Israeli leader had dared implement so openly. Trump's enthusiastic support gave him the political cover he needed, not just internationally, but domestically. It allowed him to present his most radical moves as validated by Israel's most powerful ally. That kind of legitimacy is intoxicating and ultimately corrosive. But this wasn't just about Israel. Trump's abandonment of restraint also undermined America's own strategic interests. It removed the United States from its long-held role, however flawed, as a potential broker of peace. It alienated key partners in Europe, further destabilized the region, and revealed a deeper moral failure: the inability to distinguish between genuine alliance and enabling behavior. In doing so, Trump weakened not only Israel's future prospects, but America's standing in the international system. This should concern anyone who cares about long-term stability, justice, or effective diplomacy. Because once the norms of restraint are shattered, what follows is not clarity, it is chaos disguised as control. And that chaos is precisely what we see today. In international politics, as in life, restraint is not a weakness, it is the foundation of wisdom. When power is exercised without self-discipline, it ceases to be strategy and becomes self-destruction. To fully understand how Netanyahu's leadership drifted from strategy toward spectacle, we must examine the influence of Donald Trump's political style. This wasn't merely a partnership of convenience. It was a convergence of personalities and governing philosophies. Both men operate in a world where image trumps substance, where optics are crafted to overshadow outcomes, and where the metrics of success are dictated not by long-term policy gains, but by short-term political victories and media headlines. What makes this especially dangerous from a realist perspective is that such governance abandons sober cost-benefit calculations and instead revolves around personal survival and public theater. Netanyahu, who, for most of his career, was seen as a cold strategist, a man who made calculated moves to ensure Israel's security while securing his own political longevity. But under Trump's influence, that calculation shifted. What emerged was a more theatrical Netanyahu, one increasingly addicted to symbolic victories, declarations, ceremonies, and populist gestures that played well on television, but did little to address the structural challenges facing Israel. Trump didn't just enable this transformation, he modeled it. His presidency showed that in the age of media saturation, the appearance of decisiveness, no matter how disconnected from reality, could become a currency of its own. The danger here is psychological as much as it is political. When leaders become obsessed with performance, they stop listening to dissent. They stop asking hard questions. They confuse applause with validation. And over time, they lose touch with the strategic terrain they once navigated so carefully. This is precisely what happened to Netanyahu. Trump's model of leadership, rooted in populist instinct rather than institutional discipline, gave Netanyahu a blueprint for governing through polarization and distraction. Every policy misstep could be cloaked in nationalist rhetoric. Every international rebuke could be dismissed as anti-Israel bias. But this constant performance came at a cost. While Netanyahu was preoccupied with crafting a strongman image, Israel's security landscape was shifting beneath his feet. Regional dynamics were evolving, internal social fractures were widening, and international support was eroding. Yet none of these factors were meaningfully addressed, because doing so would have required the kind of compromise and humility that neither Trump nor Netanyahu could afford politically. They were too busy playing to the gallery domestically and abroad. Mearsheimer would likely argue that this is a textbook case of strategic self-deception. When leaders prioritize ideological grandstanding over statecraft, they no longer act in the interest of the state. They act in service of their own myth. And myths, no matter how compelling, are brittle things. Eventually, reality intervenes. This is where we find ourselves now, in the aftermath of a spectacle that promised strength, but delivered fragility. And the warning is clear. When politics becomes performance, truth becomes expendable. The state doesn't collapse all at once, it erodes quietly, behind the curtain of applause. One of the most dangerous illusions in international politics is the belief that power alone can resolve complex, deeply rooted conflicts. That illusion, the idea that force, alliances, and territorial control can substitute for genuine political solutions, took firm hold in Netanyahu's thinking during Trump's presidency. And it was Donald Trump who helped cultivate and legitimize this delusion. In Mearsheimer's realist framework, such misperceptions of reality are not only common among powerful states, they are often fatal. The more a leader is shielded from consequences, the more likely they are to confuse short-term domination with long-term stability. Trump did more than support Netanyahu, he reaffirmed Netanyahu's world view. He endorsed the notion that the Palestinian issue could be permanently sidelined, that regional normalization could proceed without addressing the occupation, and that Israel could continue to entrench its control over the West Bank without triggering a global backlash. These weren't just bad policies, they were fantasies. And like all fantasies in international relations, they eventually collided with hard realities, demographic, political, and moral. The problem is that when leaders operate within a framework of denial, they begin making decisions not based on what is, but based on what they wish were true. Netanyahu, who came to believe that because the United States under Trump recognized Jerusalem, moved its embassy, and greenlit the Abraham Accords, the international consensus on Palestinian rights had been broken. But consensus is not the same as compliance. The world may have grown quieter, but the conflict did not disappear. It simply went unacknowledged, festering beneath the surface. Psychologically, this kind of denial is seductive. It allows a leader to frame every act of resistance as irrational, every criticism as illegitimate. And when reinforced by an external superpower, as Trump did repeatedly, that denial becomes systemic. What should have been a warning, the growing international isolation, the resistance on university campuses, the changing discourse in Western capitals, was dismissed as fringe activism rather than early indicators of a broader shift in global opinion. From a realist perspective, ignoring these signals is a strategic failure. Mearsheimer often stresses the importance of aligning one's policies with the underlying structure of the international system. But Netanyahu, emboldened by Trump, began crafting policies based on a misreading of that structure, assuming American hegemony was eternal, assuming Arab states would never prioritize Palestinian dignity, and assuming power would always trump legitimacy. We now see the cost of that miscalculation. Israel is more isolated than ever. The two-state solution, already on life support, is now largely seen as dead. And the one-state reality that is emerging is unsustainable both morally and strategically. Yet the seeds of this collapse were sown in the fertile ground of strategic denial, watered by Trump's applause, and harvested in Netanyahu, whose unchecked ambition. When leaders reject reality in favor of fantasy, the collapse is inevitable. It's not a matter of if, but when. And when that collapse comes, it is not only the leaders who pay the price, it is the people they were entrusted to protect. The close political and ideological alignment between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, who didn't just reshape Israel's trajectory, it also inflicted deep and lasting damage on America's strategic credibility. What's important to understand is that the United States, for decades, occupied a unique position in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While always heavily tilted in favor of Israel, Washington still managed to preserve the illusion, however thin, that it could serve as a mediator. That illusion gave the U.S. a degree of diplomatic leverage and allowed it to function, at least nominally, as a stabilizing force in the region. Trump destroyed that illusion. He didn't just favor Israel, he fully embraced Netanyahu's world, dismantling every pretense of neutrality. The embassy moved to Jerusalem, the legitimization of West Bank settlements, and the framing of the Abraham Accords as a historic breakthrough. All of these signaled to the world that America was no longer even pretending to balance interests. It had taken sides completely and unapologetically, and while that may have pleased certain domestic constituencies, the strategic cost was enormous. From a realist perspective, credibility is not about moral posturing, it's about perception. Once the U.S. was seen as complicit in entrenching occupation and enabling annexationist policies, it lost the ability to broker peace or even influence events in any meaningful way. The Arab world took notice. The Europeans took notice. And perhaps most importantly, the global South, who support the U.S., increasingly needs to confront rising global challenges, took notice. When the world sees American power as self-serving and one-sided, it ceases to follow. That's the quiet erosion of influence, the kind that doesn't make headlines but reshapes geopolitical alignments over time. This matters because legitimacy, especially for a superpower, is a force multiplier. It allows the United States to project power without always having to use it. But when that legitimacy is squandered, when it is bartered away for short-term ideological alliances like the one Trump pursued with Netanyahu, the cost is not just diplomatic. It is structural. It weakens the very foundations of American leadership, not just in the Middle East but globally, and it didn't end when Trump left office. The damage outlasted him. The Biden administration has struggled to reestablish even a baseline of credibility in the region, because Trump shifted the Overton window so far to the right that any talk of Palestinian rights now sounds radical to the very institutions that once claimed to support peace. That's how strategic distortion works. It doesn't just change policy. It changes what is politically imaginable. So we're left with a sobering reality. By aligning so closely with Netanyahu, Trump not only enabled a partner's failure, he compromised America's ability to lead. He turned diplomacy into a partisan tool, stripped it of nuance, and cast aside the very qualities that once allowed the U.S. to shape events with more than just force. When a great power trades credibility for loyalty, it may gain a friend for the moment, but it loses the world for a generation. the ultimate outcome of the Trump-Netanyahu partnership is a legacy not of strength, but of fragility, a paradoxical weakening of both Israel and the United States, even as they claimed to be asserting dominance. What was sold as clarity was, in truth, a deepening of contradictions. Netanyahu, with Trump's backing, pursued a path that sought to freeze the conflict in place, to hold power without resolution, to dominate a people without integrating them or granting them rights. But such strategies only work when the world isn't watching, and increasingly, the world is. Israel today is more polarized internally than it has been in decades. The societal fabric is fraying under the pressure of religious nationalist politics, demographic shifts, and the absence of a unifying strategic vision. Netanyahu, once seen as a master of coalition politics and national security, now presides over a country trapped in a permanent crisis mode, lurching from election to election, from one military escalation to the next, with no endgame in sight. The illusion of control that Trump helped build has shattered under the weight of accumulated contradictions. There is no coherent long-term plan, only tactics to survive the next political storm. At the same time, the United States is also dealing with the fallout. Support for Israel, once a bipartisan consensus, has become a deeply divisive issue. What Trump and Netanyahu did was inject the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into America's own culture wars. In doing so, they transformed support for Israel from a national strategic interest into a partisan identity marker. That shift may have energized certain political bases, but it has made sustaining a consistent U.S. foreign policy in the region nearly impossible, and it has alienated an entire generation of Americans, especially younger ones, who increasingly see the conflict not as a matter of geopolitical necessity, but of moral clarity. This is the deeper tragedy of the Trump-Netanyahu alliance. It politicized what should have remained strategic, and it personalized what should have been governed by institutions and long-term interests. Both men treated policy like a tool for self-preservation, and in doing so, they undermined the very foundations they claimed to defend Israeli security and American leadership. Mearsheimer often reminds us that international politics punishes those who confuse illusions with reality. And here, the illusion was that domination could be permanent, that power could replace legitimacy, and that spectacle could substitute for strategy. But the reality is now unavoidable. Israel faces increasing isolation. The United States grapples with diminished credibility, and both must confront a world that no longer accepts narratives simply because they are repeated loudly enough. When the dust settles, history will not remember how strong these leaders appeared. It will remember how vulnerable they left their nations. Because in the end, real strength is not the absence of challenge, it's the presence of vision. And without vision, even the most powerful alliances eventually crumble under the weight of their own contradictions.